Hello, and a warm welcome from John Cockburn-Evans and myself, Matthew Emerson. In partnership together and through our respective businesses, John and I offer high-value consulting and coaching expertise in the arena of leadership, change management, and cultural transformation. We've been putting together a series of blogs and podcasts on these and related topics, and today we're talking about the importance of context and perspective. And whilst this will be a relatively informal conversation between the two of us, we hope it provides some useful insights for people on both sides of the coaching and consulting equation. One of the triggers we had for discussing this topic was our respective experiences and observations that a lack of focus or appreciation of both context and perspective can lead to a significant misinterpretation, ultimately suboptimal coaching or consulting engagements. So to start us off, John, just remind me of some of your initial reflections when we first spoke about this.
Oh, well, thank you, Matthew. Yes, no, I think your introduction has it pretty well. That the danger, of course, is of not owning or not really understanding the context and the perspective the situation is that you can have misinterpretations, as you said, leading to problems. Something that could either potentially sully the coaching or consulting relationship that you've got, or take you off track. I guess one of the things, in my previous experience, when I was doing a lot of process safety consulting, we always talked about creep. And what we were talking about creep means is actually thinking you know where you are, but actually you don't know where you are and you're in a different place. The danger of that is over time, if it keeps building on itself, shall we say, is that you can go quite a way off track. You can imagine the difference, say, between true north and magnetic north, for instance. I think it's also worthwhile of noting at this point is that context and perspective are not the same. And the devil is in the detail, and understanding the differences between them is very important. So if you think about perspective, this is about the lens you use, whereas context is the situation you're in. And in reality, you need to know both, but you also need to know the difference between the two, if that makes sense, Matthew.
Yeah, I think distinguishing between context and perspective is important. As you say, they're different things and related in terms of your vantage point and how you can add value. I think in context setting, there's a danger, certainly I've found more and more, that because often we might be, and certainly clients are in a rush to find solutions. We're in an era of fast-paced change and increased pursuit of urgent fixes, get things right now. So it's difficult sometimes to make sure that you've got the space and the time to properly develop an understanding of context. Particularly, I'll focus on context to start with. So I think it would be good also just to understand some of the ways in which you can create that space and time to get context, especially when you're involved in a sort of new consulting or coaching engagement.
Yes, Matthew, you're right. And just picking up on your last point is, unfortunately, and there's some positives to it. We are in a very time-centric society, right? Which means that, that in the rush, as you say, to get things done, context could be easily forgotten or not understood. So, yeah, what can we do about it? I think there's different things we can do, either at an individual level or at a team level. So at an individual level, I think being self-aware is a very, very powerful tool. Understanding and using your emotional intelligence about what's going on around you is very important, as well as the transactional stuff, things, the task orientation as well. But you have to have the two in harmony. I know sometimes people talk about the left and the right brain, and psychologists, of course, now are, shall we say, myth busting some of the thoughts about it in terms of actually the physical physiology, of course, but actually the tags, shall we say, or the names or the metaphors hold true, where one side of the brain, is responsible for the transactional side and one side is responsible for the emotional intelligence side. It doesn't matter which side of the brain it is or how it's connected. It's understanding that those exist. We have a level of processing and logic, and we also have a level of emotional intelligence. And it's a question of using those in harmony and building up a map or a picture that will help you have the context. I know quite often when I'm talking to coach the coach, for instance, and coach leaders in businesses, I always ask them the question, given the tag of the emotional side of the brain or the transactional side of the brain, which one would you use first in any engagement? almost as a hypothesis test. And in my experience, of course, the emotional side of the brain is very important, because that's what helps build the relationships, which is very important, as you say, into a long consulting relationship. You can get into the transactional stuff a bit later on, because quite often it can be the transactional stuff that gets misinterpreted, if that makes sense, Matthew.
Yeah, it does. And I was just thinking, actually, in terms of the challenge of not only interpreting the context, but I think then in the process of doing that, playing your understanding, your awareness of what's going on back to either individual or a group of people within a client organization. I think not only to make sense of your own understanding, but also to play out where their understanding or their perspective, this perhaps comes back to the link between context and perspective, whether they think the context they're operating in is different to how you've perceived it. And I think that point about the difference of, dare I say it, emotional and or relational data, and the availability of understanding that information, is quite different to perhaps more of the transactional natured piece. But I think in developing the understanding of the context, I've always found it useful to check back with the client, and again, not necessarily to say, have I got it right, because that might be a matter of perspective, but at least to frame where I'm seeing the context and where I'm coming from. And obviously, it's quite selfishly, I'm looking for consulting engagement to be successful as well. So for me, that's a prerequisite to try and lay that foundation before we kick off. It just as an extension of that, though, John, I think it would be useful certainly for me to understand then. Some people have said to me, the context setting is just a sort of step one. So you've set, understood the context, great, move on. I tend to sort of think of the appreciation of the context as being ever present in that engagement. So I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on that and explain how you use your understanding of context in coaching and consulting engagements.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. If that's okay, I'm going to come back to that one as a sort of part two, because I was conscious that I didn't fully answer your first question. I talked about the individual and self-awareness, but obviously that's important for the team as well, because you could be part of a consulting team, and, in my corporate consulting experience, we spent a lot of time doing onboarding with people as well, and the onboarding needs to not just involve what we're going to do and dive in, where people are being tempted to do the analytical stuff or the assessments or the transactional stuff. It's the emotional onboarding. So quite often what we do, and I'm sure your experience is similar, we'd build something up like a stakeholder map. So we'd start to understand some of the personalities, or start to think about what could be driving them based on either demographic or roles, so we can understand where the risks are, right? And that's not done in a cynical way. That's done in a way to actually keep the coaching / consulting relationship going, which is win-win. You said at an individual level, of course, you wanted that to be successful. You want it to be successful on the team side, and so does the client, because they're paying you money. They want the best value for money. So in terms of the ongoing situation and the context, I think regular check-ins are important. So you need to do feedback sessions with the client, and if you're an individual consultant, obviously that will be a one-on-one with a key stakeholder. Obviously with a team, it could be the project manager. But you need to do something with that feedback. So if you were working in a team, for instance, you get that feedback, you need to bring it back to the team so they understand it. And really, get to grips with it. And I know, again from corporate consulting experience, and I'm sure it's the same in other consulting firms, is that we do nightly check-ins, right, and weekly check-ins, and we quite often go back to the hotel and then meet again after dinner at 8 o'clock, because it's this whole point of the dynamic relationship, and understanding what's going on is really, really important. And if somebody has made some observations or seen something with a client today, a particular reaction to a problem, that needs to be shared widely. What we don't want to do is bury the knowledge and the experience or the observations of the team. And it's a bit like, I know you'll be familiar with the famous iceberg model. You know, it's our values and beliefs that sit below the waterline, and sort of attitudes and behaviors, etc., and transactions that sit above. And you need to understand both. These are also very rich. I mean, you can't. It's not either or. It's and, if that makes sense, Matthew.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's challenging to get it right. Like you say, it requires a certain amount of personal and collective time to reflect and to really search for useful insights to develop that understanding, keep developing that understanding. I think when we've spoken before, we've talked about the nature of high value consulting or coaching being context rich. You can't get away from that. So wanting to spend the time to get the best understanding of the operating environment and the relationships within it, I think is important for delivering sort of high quality, high impact work. But you've talked before, and it's maybe a good segue, I guess, in terms of how you do that. You've given me good insight before in terms of the different tools you need at different stages of these engagements. And I think in terms of the way, the way I typically approach understanding context is trying to ask a lot of questions, get a lot of information, and sort of maybe an analytical approach to digesting that and playing it back. But it'd be good to hear your examples of how you go about developing that understanding and the tools you use.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Matthew. I mean, I'm an engineer by profession originally before I was a coach. So a bit like you, have a tendency to go have the analytical brain, and that's very important, very powerful. And I think things need to work in combination. Recently, and over the last 10 years, I've also done a lot of focus groups as well. So as well as getting the hard information, by looking at data, with a client, looking at, it could be financial data, it could be operational data, it could be supply chain data, very powerful, but also get the context and the perspective that sits behind that. What's really going on with the data? Is it making sense? And the best way to do that, in my experience, and I've done a number of these, is one-on-one interviews with leadership and then managers and then supervisors, but also focus groups. And of course, there's pluses and minuses with either. With senior leadership team, which I tend to do first, is that they'll have a very strategic view of what's going on, or should do, right? Hopefully, and that will give you again some context and perspectives. Then you go to the managers, and they will give you possibly some of the stresses and strains and of what they're doing, and the projects that they're on, and maybe potentially the workload and what's going on, and what their views are from a medium level perspective in terms of short to medium term. Then, of course, you've got people like supervisors and staff who are on the shop floor. That's important to get to know what they're saying, because they may be saying, well, management are saying this, but actually what's really going on is here. So that again gives you some perspective, particularly more so than context. That's what's really going on. And then it's a question of joining up the dots. So when I do the one-to-one interviews, we tend to do a diagonal slice. So it will be top to bottom, but function by function, right? You can't do everybody. You just need to have enough heuristic and enough soft data to help you provide the context and perspective to the hard data that you're going to get. There are pluses and minuses of focus groups, particularly if you look at one-to-one interviews, because it's private and confidential. There is a level of psychological safety where people are more likely to open up, right, to you on a one-to-one basis. And again, we always anonymize the data that we do in those situations. In a focus group, of course, people might be a bit more reticent to talk in front of their peer group, right? So that's the problem. It takes time to bring it out, but also, there is a danger that you get the herd mentality in a focus group, and then it can get quite controversial or confrontational. Or if you choose the wrong group, they all agree beforehand what they're going to say, and you don't get that richness and the objectivity of the data, if that makes sense, Matthew.
Yeah, it does to me, and I think the benefit of being outside, if you like, of the of a client organization, of a business, is that you can see things a bit differently, that you might pick up on things that aren't spotted, within a colleague situation. And as you say, there's a tendency that people sort of accept things the way they are or present them in the same ways. I found, just on your point about it, sort of individual interviews or focus groups, I've always found the benefit in trying to do both of those things, almost regardless of the specific content of the engagement, because, as you say, in an individual setting, you possibly get a more safe environment for people to share specific insight, and again, and their very personal perspective. But what you miss in that is there any data, spoken or unspoken, about the team dynamic and what sort of normal behaviors look like when people come together. And I think in a focus group, a very specific setting as a focus group that's designed and structured has its place. I think there's also a place for just trying to engage people in their sort of normal team environment, if that makes sense. If they have sort of normal team meetings or sort of a forum in which they would typically come together, either to provoke dialogue or just to be able to observe the dynamics in the team. I think that also helps both understand the context of the organization, but also the perspectives that each individual have on any given situation. I think that we're sort of more morphing on now to perspective, and I think the part of the point of this is, coming as a relative outsider, bringing a fresh perspective, both because you're an outsider, but also you have a different set of skills. Obviously, your experiences are different. Hopefully adds that level of objectivity and reflection. But I think the point you made about perspective is it is different depending on where you sit. So my perspective and your perspective on any given situation might be quite different to people in the organization, but I like the difference you also made between the perspective that a senior leadership team member might have and, quite frankly, anybody else in different roles in the organization. I think understanding the differences in those perspectives is equally important to being able to bring some different perspective yourself. I don't know if that's something you were leading to, John, in terms of how you were slicing and dicing the sort of organization.
Yeah, I think, yes, you're right, Matthew, and it's glad that we've moved on. I'm glad we've moved on from context into perspective. I think there are some other dimensions to perspectives too. It's not just about where you sit in the organization. I think you're right. It's likely that you're going to, as a consultant or a coach, they will definitely have a different perspective, being, on the outside of the organization, looking the outside in. One, they've been hired to do a job, and two, they won't necessarily feel the stresses and strains of the operational ebb and flow, should we say, of life, which is another reason why people bring consultants in, because it does help with a level of objectivity. Doesn't mean they're always objective, of course, because they could bring their own culture, their own perspectives anyway, and particularly if it's an industry perspective and they're working in another industry. I think the other element of perspective is recognizing that in a larger organization, there are different departments. You've got finance, HR, operations, just to name a few, and they will have their own perspectives based on the buckets that they're in, on how the organization is functioning, how well it's doing. And I've seen that on numerous occasions, where one department thinks that they're doing extremely well, and the other department thinks that they're not, that particular department isn't doing well at all. And this is where and I'm going to bring in the concepts of silos and stovepipes. Actually, the best functioning organizations are the ones that do have really strong communications. And yes, there are functional boundaries, but they're not overly stovepipe, because that can lead to potential conflict and confrontation, if that makes sense, Matthew.
Yeah, and I always think you would naturally expect the people with different functional, technical skills, different backgrounds and experiences to have different perspectives. But I think what you're saying chimes with my experience in terms of the way an organization can help share those different perspectives and either reconcile them to a good outcome or harness different perspectives in a creative, innovative type of way to get best results. I think the danger is either the different perspectives from whatever base they come from are sort of hidden away, siloed away, and not shared, or if shared as a source of frustration, or as a in a frustrating way, rather than as a source of productivity or effective functioning of an organization. I think one of the challenges, obviously, as we get into some of these engagements, is that the upside of being having a different perspective, being an expert, and having a particular lens, as you put it, on a particular set of circumstances. Also, the flip side of that is you don't know everything about how the organization works. So I often try quickly to understand the broad basis of the team functions, the organization functions, but I think it's easy to say, as a coach or consultant, you don't have a full picture, and therefore your perspective is also only through one lens. And I think that, for me, is why it's important to try and talk to a good representative sample of people around the organization. But what do you say to people that sort of suggest you might have a point of expertise, but your perspective is still, I guess, narrow, or only through one lens on a particular set of circumstances?
I think that's a very good point, and I'm going to answer that one first, and I'll come back to the other points you've made a bit later on. I think, yes, there's always going to be a challenge if somebody in a particular function department has a different perspective. I think, if there's no resolution, shall we say, for want of a better word, between perspectives, then you really got to go back to the stakeholder, right? And get the stakeholder's perspective, because ultimately there will be a hierarchy in the organization, and the stakeholder will be part of that hierarchy. And you're not doing this for fun. We don't do coaching and consulting just for fun. We do it to improve the business outcomes. And I think that is sort of the ultimate place you have to go. Obviously, before you get there, you have to try and resolve and share, and again, share it with senior leaders so they understand, because it's important for them to know if there are different perspectives of what's going on in their organization. I mean, I've seen that loads of times when people just say, well, hang on, this is not the way I see it. I see it a different way. And you need to get some sort of resolution. I think that sort of, folds back to my second point. You mentioned earlier on about how things could be either buried or hidden, in particular departments out of frustration. One way to alleviate that is, having cross-functional teams. And I know we've talked on papers about matrix management and the pros and cons of doing that. There's the adage that says, when you've got cross-functional teams, all with their own, individual, shall we say, experiences, envelopes, and boundaries, when you overlap those in the cross-functional team, the actual overall envelope or the boundaries of the overall team is considerably larger. And that sort of brings into this whole business of team diversity and neurodiversity and everything else. And things generally are not good buried, are they? It goes back to the iceberg model I talked about earlier on. I don't know if that makes sense, Matthew.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, actually. And I think we've probably got an entirely separate conversation about the composition of teams and how easily they can be formed and disbanded, and the rigidity perhaps of organizations in a traditional sense. I'm conscious, I think we are probably approaching the end. So I just wanted to ask a final question, which was really then about the combination of perspective and context. So we sort of slightly touched on this earlier. When we're in long-term client relationships, there's a danger that at some point we become part of the problem rather than the sort of architect or guide of a solution. I just wanted to pick your brains about tactics to ensure that your perspective remains objective, that your expertise sort of is the champion, if you like, of the relationship, and that you can be independent of the context rather than getting sucked into a client organization or a business environment. Wondered what you do specifically to avoid that.
That's a very good point, Matthew. I think what you're alluding to is the fact that there is a danger of potentially going native, and it is possible. I've seen it happen. I've done some very large engagements around the world, and yeah, that goes into where people start getting into the perspective, or overly, shall we say, into the perspective of the client. It is all about balance, as you say, and I think this is a really understanding what your role is one of the key things. Understand that a client is a client, right? You're a provider or a contractor providing services, and having that respectful distance does help, right? And just achieving that balance. And I think there's no one size fits all quick answer to this, but the best thing to do is these regular check-ins, with the team. understand that the client needs value, the voice of the customer, and understanding, of course, who those clients are. Who's your real stakeholder, who's the overall stakeholder is very, very important. And it's almost like, well, you have to check in and you have to check out continually to go and understand what's really going on, and that's where you'll maintain the balance and perspective. I mean, of course, the other factor in this is you could be working with multiple clients as well, which also helps because you're not overly invested or vested into one client. So there's a number of things to do in that space, but I think understanding the environment, what it really means, and also being self-aware. That's being self-critical and self-aware. There's lots of papers on that now, around the importance of being self-aware, which is really not just how you impact on yourself, but it's your impact on the environment, and the environment's impact on you. Knowing that deeply will help considerably. I guess I just want to finish on one final point, which, again, circling back to the whole question of the topic about the context versus perspective. One of the tools, we talked right at the start of this, about focus groups and interviews, and also analytical data and assessments. One of the tools, or one of the thinkings, is probably a better word, approaches I use, is understanding how you hit the target. For instance, initially, when you start any engagement, you will know considerably less. And if you can imagine a target sitting behind a white sheet, the question would be, would you use a sniper rifle? You've got to hit the overall target, or would you use a blunderbuss? Well, you probably use a blunderbuss because you've got no idea where that target is to start with. So you're going to go wide rather than deep, for instance. Later on, once you've created more relationships, got more data, done more analysis, and you know what's really going on, well, then you might think, well, okay, maybe I'm going to use a sniper rifle because I really need to go and hit that target. It's a bit like, I suppose the analogy is going down a funnel, isn't it? You start wide and then you go narrow and deep, if that makes sense, Matthew.
It absolutely does. Yeah, I think finding the target first before you can hit it makes it a lot simpler to understand. I was just going to say, I think for a lot of the conversation we've had, there's probably no easy answers, but I think that last point at least resonates in my mind about the difference of actually having to define and find the target before you address it. And like you say, it requires different tools. Thank you, John. As always, insightful for me. I always learn a lot from you when we talk. So thank you for joining me today. And thank you for anybody who's taken the time to listen. I hope you've enjoyed the insights as we've been talking, found something useful in what we've discussed, and listened to future podcasts in this series as we attempt to tackle different topics that are common to the world of engaging in coaching and consulting work. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Really appreciate it. As you said, it's always a pleasure talking, and I get a lot of benefit from our discussions.